Attention to orders. This week's killed in action, active duty, Captain Andreas O'Keefe, Captain Christopher Zantes, Master Sergeant Christopher Raguso, Captain Mark Weber, Master Sergeant William Posh, Staff Sergeant Carl Enos, Staff Sergeant Deshaun Briggs. Local Indiana veterans. David Rodas, U.S. Army. Leon Taylor, U.S. Marines, Vietnam. Jack Berg, U.S. Army, World War II, Indy Honor Flight. James Frieden, U.S. Navy, World War II. Merle Dorfin, U.S. Air Force, Forlorn Airlift. Peter Wilkins, U.S. Navy. Gary Graff, U.S. Navy, Korea. Charles Stein, U.S. Army, Korea. Edwin Hyatt, U.S. Marines, Vietnam. Roger Foote, U.S. Navy. Gene Neal, U.S. Navy. Melvin Schwartz, U.S. Navy, World War II. Eugene Schimmer, U.S. Army, Vietnam. David Markham, U.S. Navy. Richard Taylor, U.S. Navy. John Holmes, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II. Charles Cashdollar, U.S. Navy, World War II. Mickey Edmonton, U.S. Army. James Thapara, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Harry Francis, U.S. Army. Edwin Beismeyer, U.S. Navy. Norman Wiggum, U.S. Army. Robert Schumacher, U.S. Army. Robert Parsons, U.S. Navy. William Campbell, U.S. Air Force. Alfred Ditzel, U.S. Army. Sonny St. John, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Stephen Green, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam. Scott Hall, U.S. Navy. Gerhard Rick, U.S. Army. Eugene Harshberger, U.S. Army, Korea and Vietnam. William Knifley, U.S. Army. Maurice Bickler, U.S. Army, World War II. Clyde Thatcher, U.S. Navy, Korea. Veterans around the nation. S.L. Cambry, U.S. Army, World War II. Velma Barnes, U.S. Army. William Ross, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II. Roger Reel, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Keith Fee, U.S. Army National Guard. Doug Niemeyer, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Louis Arvin, U.S. Army. Jerome Barr, U.S. Army. Robert Seitz, U.S. Air Force, Korea. Richard Schoengert, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Chris Schellenberger, U.S. Army. Bob Wetson, U.S. Navy, Vietnam. Frank Bedaro, U.S. Army, World War II. Christopher Potter, U.S. Army. Police and Fire, killed in the line of duty. Rodney Baker, Madison Township Fire Department, Ohio. Deputy Ryan Zirkle, Marion County Sheriff's Department, California. And Officer Andres Cabarro, Junis Municipal Police Department, Puerto Rico. Rosie the Riveters. Irma Bailey. Doris Bragdon. Marion Cox. Mary Crowder. Anna Estrada. Rosie Fass. Ella Harvison. Pearl Hill. Winata Kanielski. Adrena Maurer. Betty Rapowski. Cruz Leo. Marjorie Schenk. And Helen Vollmer. POWs recently recovered. Air Force Master Sergeant Donald Hall, 29 of Stroud, Oklahoma. Missing in action February 2nd, 1967, when his rescue helicopter was shot down over Vietnam. Remains were recovered and identified March 17th of this year. Army Corporal Dow Warden, 20, of Broadman, Oregon. Missing in action September 28, 1951 on Heartbreak Ridge. Remains recovered in February of 2016 and identified March of this year. Army Air Force's First Lieutenant Frank Fotsky, 22, of Trenton, New Jersey, accounted for on August 7, 2017, went missing in action on May 27, 1944, when his P-47 was shot down over France and was identified March of this year. Army Corporal Thomas Mullins, 18, of Harriman, Tennessee, died November 2nd, 1950 as a POW in North Korea. Was returned in March of 2017 and identified March of this year. Sergeant Seasting. Sergeant Martin.
Here.
Gunnery Sergeant Cox.
Present.
Sergeant Waltz. Sergeant Richard Waltz. Sergeant Richard H. Waltz.
Sergeant Waltz has completed his earthly mission.
Sergeant also is present and accounted for.